Hello, welcome. My name is Rachel and I am the producer at Awards. We're streaming live on Awards Academy. If you enjoy this live session, then go and have a look at the courses that we've got on offer. We've got WebGL, portfolio design, art direction, plenty of valuable skills for you to add to your designer's toolkit. So don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and so you can be kept up to date with all the live sessions and all our other content that we're going to be putting out. So yeah, let's kick off. Let's start today's live. Let's welcome Gabe.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi,
Thanks
Gabe.
for having me. Hi, everybody. Excited to be here.
All right, so we've got Gabe Clapper. He is designer on Google's People and AI research team. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Gabe.
Thanks, Rachel. Should I go ahead and kick it off?
Yeah, go ahead. So yeah, remember everyone, we're going to do a Q&A at the end, and really hope you'd enjoy this presentation. So have a good one.
Thanks, Rachel. See you again at the end. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. Again, my name's Gabe. I'm a staff designer on Google Research, which is sort of the academic research part of the company, and specifically on the People Plus AI research team, which we call PAIR. And I'm excited to introduce and talk about today the all-new updated second edition of the People Plus AI Guidebook. We're going to talk all the way through it and how you can use it to make people-centered AI-based products. First, just some quick sort of like context setting and housekeeping on PAIR itself. Again, People Plus AI Research. We're a mix of UXers and product people and engineers and research scientists, and we sort of work at the intersection of human-computer interaction and AI. And what that means is that we focus on understanding AI and sort of how to usher in this new era of technology, excuse me, in a human-centered way. And that's sort of the focus of our work overall, and where the guidebook comes from. So the guidebook itself is a toolkit for you to use to help make those people-centered AI product decisions. You can follow along today. We're going to go into the guidebook and dig deep on a lot of the content there. You can follow along at pair.withgoogle.com/guidebook. I'll probably say that URL like 100 times today, so that you all remember it. I think Rachel might put it in the chat as well. And the guidebook is a result of over 100 people at Google and across Alphabet, synthesizing everything that we've learned in recent years about how to design AI-based products, and putting that into practice for anybody to be able to follow and apply. And the second edition specifically, I'm really excited about. We just launched it about a month ago now at I/O, and it's really based on action-oriented materials. So over the past 2 years since we launched the first edition of the guidebook, which was a little bit more, if any of you saw it, was a little bit more like a textbook that you would sit down and read. Excuse me. And we heard again and again that people just needed more and wanted more about how to apply the materials to practice. So what we did is we added a set of design patterns that are action-oriented that I will share with you momentarily, and case studies, and a workshop kit, which we're also going to go over today. As well as we launched the first edition in 2019. That was 2 years ago, and the field is advancing so quickly. There's also just new insight and content, not simply just the format itself. So like I said, the guidebook is now oriented around 23 action-oriented design patterns. We're going to go over those today and how to apply them to the work that you're doing on these types of products. And the basic gist here is that we're product people too. You'll see some examples in here of stuff that I've worked on, that other people at Google have worked on in making these decisions. And we know how hard it is and how you never have enough time to be able to do the stuff that you want to do. And so we've built the entire guidebook to try to make it as easy as possible for you to make great decisions quickly. Okay, so before we dive deep into the guidebook itself, I'm going to take a quick step back and talk a little bit about this notion of human-centered AI at a high level, the way that we think about it, the way that we apply it, and kind of just the overall mindset of where the guidebook comes from. So the first thing here, and this is like if you take away nothing else from this talk, you can look up everything in the guidebook itself later on. But if you remember one thing, please remember this exact statement here, which is that humans, occasionally brilliant, but also flawed and biased humans, shape everything there is about AI, either intentionally or unintentionally. That there's this kind of superficial understanding of the way that ML works, where you've got some system with a goal defined and you just dump in a whole bunch of data, the more the better. And then like, voila, you end up with this amazing system that detects or predicts whatever it is that you want. But in the real world, that's just not how it works when you dig into the details. That you train a system on a set of data. Well, where did that data come from? Some set of humans collected it. Some set of humans filtered it and sanitized it and decide what data to include and what data not to. Another set of humans will have labeled that data to guide the system in a particular direction. And then when it comes time to train the machine learning algorithm, the model we call it, it is trained on some objective, something that it's optimized for, also decided by people. And then, of course, at the end of the day, the predictions the model makes also impact people. And then those people usually feedback their behavior into the model, which trains it even more. And so there are implicit and explicit human decision making along this entire process. And so all we're trying to do is apply the same user-centered design thinking that we do in typical classical digital products to this overall process of making machine learning products, so that we can have more people-centered results come out at the other end. Because excuse me, because AI is still relatively new in terms of like mainstream digital products, we hear a lot of this type of thing. People get really excited about the technology and they say, oh, we want to make 10 AI-based features in the next quarter. And we try to flip that around from a technology first perspective to a human first perspective. So first we ask, whether a problem is valuable to solve. Instead of saying, can we use AI to do X? We ask, is X a human need that exists in the world that we want to solve? So first we have a valuable problem to solve, and then we can figure out if AI is a good solution for it. And this is like a deceptively simple thing that we do all the time, which is just the simple 2x2 of, what's the value, what's the user impact of this thing, and then is ML a good fit or not? And there are things that ML is a good fit for and things that it's not. And the thing importantly to take away here is that machine learning isn't free. It's actually really, really expensive compared to your classic heuristic-based algorithms. And so there's a cost to that. So instead of just getting excited about the technology, it's really important to take a step back and figure out whether it's a good fit for the problem you're trying to solve, so that you don't invest a lot of the organization's time and money and energy in building an ML solution that might turn out to be, lackluster at best or harmful at worst. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit into the weeds here to further go down this path of human-centered AI, to talk a little bit about how it works. So machine learning algorithms are at their core predictive. They make predictions of a particular thing. So like, if you're trying to detect cats, what the machine learning algorithm does is it predicts with a certain percentage of confidence whether the thing it's seeing is a cat or not. And so what that does when you evaluate is it creates this 2x2 matrix of the prediction of yes, this is a cat, or no, it's not. And then what it turned out to be in the real world, was that prediction right or wrong? So that creates these four quadrants of true positives and true negatives. Those are the right answers. But then where it gets interesting are false positives and false negatives. False positive is the machine says, yes, this is a cat, and it turned out to be a dog or whatever else instead. Or a false negative where it says, no, this isn't a cat, and it did turn out to be a cat. Now, when you're detecting cats, this is not a huge deal for the most part. But you can imagine when you're deciding who should get a loan, or credit card fraud, or these types of higher stakes scenarios, that the way you think about false positives and false negatives and how those are caught up in the system, actually directly affects some human person at the end of the day. And so we need to design these systems with that in mind and making sure they're accounting for that. Which brings us to this notion of precision and recall. So precision and recall are sort of a representation of the way that these systems are not static. They are tuned in a particular direction. And what that means is that there are, again, human-based decisions that you have to make. So precision over on the left, notice that the green circle is a lot smaller. It's trying to be more precise, where all the green thumbs ups in there are saying that we're only going to get right answers. We're going to only show you things that we're really, really confident are actually cats. And that means that we're going to leave out all the wrong answers. But we're also, because we're trying to be so precise, we're also going to leave out some things that turned out to be cats in the end. Whereas over on the right, recall is a much bigger circle. We scoop up more stuff into the ultimate set of what we give back to the user. And that is balancing for, you know what, we're going to make sure that we show the user every single cat, knowing that we're also then going to include some of those wrong answers along the way. We're going to include some things that turned out to be dogs and not cats after all. And the important thing to note here is that this is not a have your cake and eat it too situation. This is kind of a balance that you have to strike based on the needs that the problem that your product is solving for, based on the stakes of the situation, based on like the way that you're able to make up for precision and recall trade-offs in the UI decisions that you make. And so you can imagine that precision is really important in high stakes situations where you better be getting it right, even if you're going to let a few things fall through the cracks. Whereas recall is better in situations where you want to show users a lot of stuff and allow them to filter out the things that they think actually are wrong, that the system wasn't able to detect that are wrong. And so this is just an example of like a nitty gritty of the way that ML works at a fundamental level, where there are very human-based decisions and user-centered product-based decisions that UXers need to be involved in, or at least understand in such a way that we can make good decisions about the way that the UI should work in order to support those. Okay, let's dive into the guidebook itself. So now that we have a better understanding of human-centered AI at a high level, we're going to do a tour through some of the guidebook's AI design patterns. Like I said before, there are 23 of them overall. We are not going to go through all 23. I picked out a representative set of some of my favorites to give you kind of a taste of what they're like. And if that 23 number is a little bit overwhelming, don't worry, we've got that covered too. In the guidebook itself, we've further organized the patterns by what we call guiding questions that you can filter by. So these are things like, onboarding new users, or explainability, or control and feedback, managing data sets. All of these are kind of like top level categories you can think of that will bring you to usually like 3 to 5 patterns in each category that you can get to where you need to go based on whatever topic is top of mind for you. And then the patterns all kind of interlink between one another so that you can find your way to relevant stuff as you go. So again, like I said, feel free to follow along in the guidebook itself. We're going to go through, I think I have like 5 or 6 of these picked out. Okay, first and foremost, my absolute favorite pattern in the whole guidebook is what's called set the right expectations. And this is based on the notion of calibrating user trust. So helping users trust the system as much as they should, and no more and no less. And the idea here is, like we just talked about with the precision and recall and the confusion matrix of false positives and false negatives, these systems are predictive. They will get things wrong at certain times. And so, unlike traditional algorithms where we're like, oh, if there's an error, if there's an edge case, then we need to do these things. It's like the notion of the system being wrong has to be built in at a more fundamental level because of their predictive nature. So what we do is we help users calibrate their trust so that they don't trust it too much or too little. And this notion of trusting something too much is something that's like relatively new in thinking about ML. That in the tech industry, we tend to promise the moon. We tend to use words like magic, and AI is sometimes described as a black box that you can't possibly understand how it works. So you just have to go with it. And the basic idea here is to sort of like fight against that type of techno magic thinking, and make sure that users understand what the system is good for and what it's not, and that's okay. We don't need to promise that it does everything when it in fact doesn't, so that users are able to trust it at the right level. So if you imagine something hypothetical like a system that scans food labels and tells you whether they contain allergens, and I have a kid with a tree nut allergy, so this sort of example is close to home for me. then users better know what types of foods it works for, what languages of labels that the thing is able to read, and where it can be used and where it can't, so that they don't trust it in a situation they just shouldn't, and get themselves into trouble. So that's the notion of calibrating trust. So the thing to think about here is where in your system might you need to calibrate trust to actually bring the user's trust in the system's ability down, so that their trust in the system as a whole can be properly calibrated and then go up in the end. Okay, next up, add context from human sources. So this is another favorite. And the basic idea here is to put humans in the loop in the way that the system presents its recommendations or its predictions. And there are two ways that we think about doing this here, either from third-party experts or social proof from contextually relevant sources. So the third-party experts is like, the like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste kind of thing, except ideally with more substance behind it than that, which is that when your system provides a recommendation, it's good to know that that recommendation is coming from some like objectively trustable source. So rather than just saying, this is what Google says, or in this case, in our hypothetical example, this is what Owl, the tutor app says. Say that this information in the example on this slide came from the Princeton University Press, a source that would be objectively trusted on this particular topic. And then on the other side, contextually relevant social human relationships go a long way. So in the Run app example, we have something that says, this recommendation exists because this trail is highly rated among people in your running group, right? Like people that or otherwise have some connection to, that is kind of hyper local, hyper relevant to you, that you're able to say, okay, it's not just that the system had like 87% confidence that this is a good trail, it's actually bolstered by some human source behind it. And where that comes from in the research is this notion that trust is a transitive property, right? You move trust around from person to person based on who you know. So I just mentioned my kiddo. I have a 3-year-old here at home, and we're just starting to go out again now that the pandemic is abating a bit. But before the pandemic, we used to, sometimes hire a babysitter and actually leave the house ever. And so if I'm looking for a babysitter and I need somebody that I can trust with my kid, if I have a friend that I trust that has a babysitter that they trust, then I can transfer my trust from my friend to their babysitter. And it's this notion that trust is kind of this commodity that moves around from person to person. This is why like word of mouth marketing for for services like a babysitter or plumbing or electricity, any of these types of things is really important, because otherwise I would have to personally vet every single person that I was going to use to do anything that was of any kind of stakes at all. And just in human social relationships, we just simply don't have time for that. So the idea here is to take advantage of trust as a transitive property and try to transfer a user's trust in some social relationship network that they have into the system by bolstering the trust against that social network, or again a third party expert. All right. Next up, anchor on familiarity. So this is based on the notion that because AI, like I said, is relatively new in terms of mainstream products, and there's a lot of this kind of magical thinking around how it works and what it does, and because it is kind of fundamentally different around it making predictions and recommendations rather than being so definitive as a heuristic-based algorithm, that people need kind of familiar touch points and like what I like to think of as kind of like footholds to to scaffold their mental model of the way that the system works, so that they can then actually wrestle with the thing that is fundamentally new. So rather than focus so much on the newness of the system and introduce people to it by like describing it as magic and by like introducing new types of mental models into the UI, to give them familiar touch points. So a great example of this is a product I worked on called Google Clips, a little camera that had an AI inside of it that took the pictures for you. And now Google Clips was not a smashing market success. A lot of you probably never even heard of it, but it taught us a lot about how to make human-centered AI decisions. And the first thing to note here is the camera itself. And this may sound really obvious to you now, but just it looks like a camera. This is something that wasn't obvious to us early on. We were so focused on the kind of like the newness and the magic of this system that our original prototype design for the camera was this kind of like interesting bespoke artifact that I think would belong in an art museum today, but like didn't shout camera-ness. And so people were just like not entirely sure that it was a camera at all, and thus had a really hard time kind of like using that mental model as a foothold to then understand that it was a camera that took the pictures for you. The UI itself is another example. This is like the UI that we ended up with, just a simple one-dimensional feed, familiar mechanism, like you swipe right on the things that you like and swipe left on the things that you don't, something that people are used to, now in a modern feed-based UI. And before, the UI was sort of, like I said, more bespoke. It was kind of this weird mix of a camera and a movie player, and people had a really hard time just grasping fundamentally, what does this product do? And when we anchored it in all of these familiar touch points, they had a much easier time going, oh, okay, I get it. It's a camera. I know how cameras work. And I can use that understanding to then extrapolate to the thing that's new, which is that it takes the pictures for me, and then I can review them later and decide what I want to keep and what I don't. Google Photos is another great example of this here. This is the somewhat recently launched uh, memories feature in Google Photos, where they went with this more familiar stories format that appears at the top of the screen, scrolls to the right, portrait format, something that has become very common as a UI convention to show people memories from certain amounts of time ago, 1 year, 2 years, etc. And they changed to this from what used to be called like the Photos Assistant, which was like this place in the app you would go visit, and the assistant had like made things for you, more of this kind of like magical AI agent type of model. And when they moved to this stories format instead, people are able to engage more easily because, okay, here's a UI convention I already understand, and now I'm able to take that simpler, smaller step forward to, I know what the AI is doing here, which is picking out photos for me that I may want to recall, years later. So more on this feature actually in an upcoming pattern. Okay, next up is go beyond in the moment explanations. So this is getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty now of explainability in a system like this. And what a lot of folks do with explainability in a UI is they focus on those in the moment decisions of, we're recommending this video because you liked this other video, for example. And those are really important, but that's oftentimes where explainability kind of stops. And the notion here with this pattern is to go beyond that, to expand the surfaces in which you can describe to the user the way the system works, and specifically to focus on kind of how the system works at a high level, so that by the time they show up to those in the moment decisions, they kind of have a contextual understanding of the way the system works overall, that they can use to understand and then trust those in the moment decisions. So a good example of this is this video here on YouTube of the way that Google search works. And if you notice there in the screenshot, this is almost an hour long, like feature length movie about the way that Google search works. And just since October of last year has something like 90 million views. So it gets into the nitty gritty of like the whole pipeline of the way that Google search produces its results. And people want to have this information so that they can trust that where a given search result comes from and how it works. Now, I recognize this is a bit of an extreme example. Not everybody is going to go produce a feature-length movie about the way that their system works. In fact, they have another version of this that's only 5 minutes long. But the idea here is to figure out the right touch points, whether it's marketing materials or your App Store and Google Play Store pages, or even help documentation, to help your users understand the way the system works at a high level, so that then they can trust it in the moment and be able to relate the in the moment explanations to this higher level understanding. Next, we're going to get back down into the weeds on data. And I'm just going to mention again, like I did before with like the precision and recall stuff, that it's important that we as UX professionals start to be able to grapple with and understand things that may seem sort of foreign to us or may seem too technical for us, so that we can shape the direction of these types of products. And we have now this like big, the big Twitter discussion and sort of at this point joke is like, should designers code? And I think the new question is going to be like, should designers data? And so this pattern is called invest early in good data practices. And the idea here is that because these systems are trained on data that is input and then is labeled and is sanitized and filtered in a bunch of different ways, that early problems you have with the data can have a major impact down the road as you get into model deployment and production. That if you start with an incomplete view of the data, if you start with data that doesn't actually reflect the real world environment in which the system is going to be used, if you don't document that data appropriately, and the labelers who are labeling the data can't do so appropriately, or the tools that you built for them aren't appropriate to be able to label the data in the best ways, if you don't value that and don't invest in it, then you're going to end up with a system that doesn't actually work the way you expected it to, and you've invested a lot of time and money and energy in building something that's actually just not going to work, or may produce harmful results. So a great example of this is this thing called Project Guideline. Was a partnership between Google Research and this organization called Guiding Eyes for the Blind. And what they did is they built this system to help folks with low vision be able to run and jog independently by tracking yellow lines painted onto a pathway and then using auditory signals in headphones to help keep them on the path. And where they started, you can see in the slide here, is by thinking, oh, well, we could use data that's been trained for self-driving cars. There's a ton of that data out there in the world. We've been training data on self-driving cars for years now. Seems like it's really similar, following a path based on a painted line on the road. Let's just use that. But what they found in practice is that even something as simple as like the angle of the camera to the road, where on a self-driving car it's mounted up high, it's facing out, as opposed to in their system the user wears a waist belt where the camera points down at the paved path as they run. That even something as simple as that, let alone like all of the many other things that are going on a road when you're driving, just basically made this data essentially useless to them. And so they went back to the drawing board and they got volunteers to strap on these belts with cameras and run along pathways to be able to train based on that. And then they did this really interesting thing where they used synthetic data that they built in like a 3D model environment to handle edge cases like low light, or things on the road like fallen leaves and that type of thing. And so the overarching point here is that the way you ingest and manage and label data is a design decision. It's actually a bunch of design decisions. And in order to get the product to behave the way you want in the end, that data and that system needs to be trained in the appropriate environment. And so as user-centered thinkers, we as UX pros need to inject our user-centered thinking into that process to make sure that we end up with systems that behave the way that we want in the end, not just on the user's behalf, but so that we don't waste a bunch of time for the business and the team and the organization as well. Okay, I think we got two more. Let users supervise automation. So this is about control and feedback over the system. And the basic high-level idea with this pattern is to not like railroad over your users with automation and not assume that full automation should be the explicit end goal in all situations. That users need to be able to retain agency over the system in order to have a sense of control and confidence, and to be able to trust what you're giving them. A great example of this is, I mentioned earlier I was going to bring up Google Photos again. So this is their control settings for that memories feature, where you can hide specific people from it, people or pets. You can hide particular date ranges, and there are a bunch of other configuration settings in here as well. And this may seem simple and innocuous, of like, oh, it's just pictures, what's the big deal? But if you think about it, you can easily imagine situations where like, I don't want this person popping up in my feed anymore every year that this particular anniversary of something goes by. Or there might be a particular date range that was, in whatever way, not something that I want to relive over and over again. And so you can go in there and you can hide those. And the important thing to note here that we like to think about is that the feature is not the controls themselves. The feature is the peace of mind knowing that the controls are there. And I don't have this data from the Google Photos team, but I would just venture to guess that the engagement level on these settings is like relatively low compared to the number of people that engage with the feature overall. You know, a lot of people stick to the defaults. We know that as UX professionals, the defaults are really important for that reason. But the important thing to note here is that users know those settings are there should they need them. And that gives them the peace of mind that if they want to control something, they can. And that gives them more trust and more comfort to be able to use the system in the way that they see fit for them, even if they never actually touch those controls. Okay, last one, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about some other parts of the guidebook. Be accountable for your errors. So this is another favorite of mine, and reintroduces this notion that because ML systems are predictive, they will get things wrong. And so we need to build for the fact that errors will occur, and it's not just maybe, it is when. And so the idea here is to be accountable for that, understand in advance what types of errors can occur, what types of harms might result from those errors, and be able to either mitigate them after they happen or prevent them from ever happening in the first place. There are a few ways to do this. Providing a way forward is sort of like your classic like error heuristic of like make sure the user has something they can do after the fact. That's, you know, every bit as, if not more important in an ML based product than a traditional one. Or making changes to the product. So the example here is, you know, you said this plant was okay for cats. Turns out it's not. To be able to have a review and a feedback system to make sure that people can input that information, and then the system actually changes as a result. A great example of this is in Google Flights. So not sure if any of you are familiar with or use Google Flights, but it has this handy feature that will predict whether the price of the flight will go up or down. And they do a bunch of things to calibrate user trust, like I talked about before, including that they just won't show a prediction at all if they're not super confident about it going up or down or staying the same. But one of the things that they piloted a while back that I just like personally hope that they bring back is this price guarantee program. So the idea here was that if they said, you know, you should buy this flight now because it's going to stay the same or go up. And then instead, the cost of the flight goes down. They essentially cost you money with that recommendation because you could have waited and you could have bought the flight at a lower price. And what they piloted was this program where if that happened, they would actually refund you the difference in the fare. And I just love this as an error accountability. And again, that notion, like I said before, with controls, where it's not even the feature itself, it's the peace of mind knowing the feature exists. Like because they only showed high confidence predictions to begin with. Again, I don't have the numbers on this, but I would venture to guess this price guarantee program just didn't ever get used all that much. But just knowing that it's there should something go wrong is the thing that gives users the peace of mind they need to be able to go out on a limb and trust that the system is making the right prediction, because they were stating up front that we will be accountable for whether the system gets it right or not. And so the thing to think about here is, what errors can your system produce? What harm might that cause? And thus, what should you do? What sort of programs or service design should you put in place to be able to make sure that the user is kind of protected from those errors and can go forward from them without getting burned by the system, making a wrong prediction. All right, that's it for patterns. But I would love to talk with you a little bit about the workshop. After you spin through those 23 patterns in the guidebook and sort of figure out which ones are relevant to you, the next thing you might think about is how to apply them directly to what you work on. And that's why we made this companion workshop to go along with the patterns in the guidebook. The workshop is sort of like low key my favorite new part of the guidebook. If you're following along, just click on workshop up in the top nav. And you'll see the resources there. There's a set of slide decks and a facilitator guide. And so basically all you need to do is download the slide deck, download the facilitator guide, and the facilitator guide is basically a big checklist that'll help you set up and plan the workshop for your team. And the workshop is scaffolded off of the traditional Google design sprint process. If you're not familiar with that, or if you haven't facilitated workshops, I would again venture to guess that those are other courses or sessions that you could get into here on Awards Academy. And our workshop assumes some light knowledge of facilitation, but there's also a lot of there to help you get it up and running, even if you don't have a ton of experience with it. The default mode of the workshop, as you see here on the slide, is a 2-day workshop that goes entirely like through the whole process. And the whole thing was built virtually. We built this entire program during the pandemic while we've all been working from home. So we've run this workshop over a dozen times internally at Google to like vet it and get it ready. And not a single one of those workshops has ever happened in person. So this is sort of like built from the ground up for virtual teams. I'm actually really excited to be able to run it in person at some point just to see how that goes. And don't be scared off by the 2-day thing. I know 2 days is it's either not enough time or too much time, depending on how you look at it. But even though it's presented in this way, it can really be picked apart based on your needs. And the facilitator guide has like a whole modularization guide within it that you can use to pluck out which pieces and activities are right for you and kind of like Lego brick the workshop together in the way that works for you and your team. So I'm going to talk through a few of the activities here, again, like I did with the patterns, just to give you a flavor of the way that the workshop is constructed and what types of activities you might find in there, because this is really where the rubber meets the road and taking the lessons of the patterns and applying them directly to what you're working on and making decisions for your products. So first is AI onboarding. So this is about getting new users into the system. And what this activity does is it walks you through the strengths and weaknesses of your system to present users with kind of a human-based mental model of that. So it asks a lot of questions like, if a human were doing this task that your system does, what would they be good at? What would they be bad at? How can you sort of relate that to what the system is good at and bad at, to present that back to the user in a frame of mind that they might understand? Depending on the system that you're making, if it's like an expert system in a business environment, it might even be a task that the human is used to doing themselves, that now they're going to have an automated assistive system do for them. So they're going to bring all of that mental model, all of that baggage into the way the system works and expect to be able to kind of translate from the way that they're used to doing it into the way the system does it. So this activity helps you kind of walk through all of that and then come out with onboarding recommendations on the other side. One of my favorite parts of this is this thing we call AI weirdness, which is like specifically where does the system not behave the way a human would expect? Because the way that it's trained or the way that it makes its predictions is not based on the way that a human would do it, and finding ways to explain that back to the user in a way that they'll understand. Next is a specific one around explanation. So a lot of ML work turns out to be not just what the system does, but the way that you articulate that and communicate it back to the user, like we talked about earlier with like that search video and things like that. So this is an activity that helps you walk through kind of the user state of mind during any given what we call critical moment of the product journey. And then use that state of mind and like what the user is going to be thinking and wrestling with in any given moment to then write new explanations for the product about the way that it works and the way that it makes those decisions. Next is errors and harms. So this is sort of directly relevant to that be accountable for your errors pattern that I talked about earlier. And the basic gist here is it walks you through all those same critical moments in the product journey, helps you figure out where errors could possibly occur, and then write up either mitigation plans or prevention plans for those errors. And then you come out with this kind of like templated error strategy for any given error of the way that you will sort of, kind of create a safety net for users underneath that error occurring. And finally here, this one is trust calibration. So this is an activity based directly on that very first pattern that I went over, setting the right expectations. So this is finding, again, moments in the product where the user might trust the system too much or not enough, help you discuss those and tease them apart as a team, and then figure out how to bring trust to the right place. If the user is under trusting the system in a particular way, how to sort of like work that back to the middle, or, importantly, like I talked about, if the user is over trusting the system, to bring that down and figure out how to talk to them about what the system can and can't do. And then finally, I mentioned the facilitator guide already, but here's just a shot of it so that you can see it. There's a ton of information in here. The main mode of it, like I said, is basically a checklist that you can just follow step by step by step to plan and run the workshop with your team. We're about to get into the Q&A here. If people have questions about the workshop and how it works, I'm happy to dig into them. So with that, we're gonna start coming to a close here. The guidebook is launched and ready to use. Again, the URL is pair.withgoogle.com/guidebook. It's built on this best knowledge that we've acquired, internally, and now after 2 years of external use in the industry from folks like yourselves, product people and UXers all around the world. So please go check it out. I hope that it's useful and makes it easier for you to make human-centered AI products. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our Medium channel. You can think of this as kind of a companion to the guidebook. We're at medium.com/people-AI-research. And this sort of gets into the broader context of human-centered AI that I talked about earlier. There's just a ton of interesting content there, think pieces and interviews. There's a podcast, lots of great stuff to kind of wrap your head around this overall project of human-centered AI. And it's a great, sort of, like I said, companion piece to the guidebook. And with that, thank you so much for your time. Again, the URL is pair.withgoogle.com/guidebook. My Twitter handle is there if you want to reach out directly. And I'd love to now welcome Rachel back and take some of your questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, Gabe. Thank you very much. That was very interesting and lots of information there. So let's have a look at some questions. Okay, so we've got a question here. What are some other patterns to be on the lookout for that you didn't go over?
Yeah, great question. Like I said, there are 23 of them, so I could go on and on for hours about this. One thing that I didn't talk a lot about are, I guess, two patterns actually that are kind of sort of sisters to one another. The first is explain the benefit, not the technology, and then the other one is determine if AI adds unique value. And basically, these just call into question something that I talked about at the start, which is that AI is really useful for certain situations. Like, for example, when you need to personalize something for the user and provide personal recommendations. But it's not great in other situations. Like, a simple example is like in open source software where the exact way that the system works needs to be fully transparent. And so there are a lot of places where you may not want to use AI. And then even if you do, this focus on the benefit, not the technology, is to, in your sort of explainability and your basically your conversation with the user, you want to make sure that you're focusing on what this thing does for the person, not the fact that it's based on AI. So those are two that I would have put in here, but cut out for time that you can go take a look at. And like I said, there are a lot more as well. Oh, Rachel, you're muted.
We need an AI that can predict when I'm going to talk so it can unmute me. So a question from Kiara. What methods do you use to calibrate trust? Are there other methods than to talk to the user? Because people don't always read, listen to everything, especially when they already overtrust the AI.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I might take a step back from that a little bit. So trust is something we think a lot about. You heard trust come up over and over and over again. It's this sort of like human-based metric in what is otherwise like a very technical system. And to be perfectly honest, I think we're just now figuring out how to measure trust and how to do so in an appropriate way so that we're not like leaving out a lot of that human context. And so I think this is like an emerging study. So I don't have like super definitive answers, but one way you can imagine is to just there are trust-based metrics that we've developed, and we use surveys and other implicit data to try to get at how much a user trusts something. And then, but honestly, a lot of it comes down to being able to understand like the relationship between trust and those errors and harms. And so like the trust calibration exercise and the errors and harms exercise in the workshop that I mentioned are kind of a piece. That what you really need to understand are the errors that can occur based on that over trust so that you can go back and learn how to correct for it. I gave the example of the Google Flights price prediction thing, and again, that's not a live working feature. It was something that they piloted. But I think that's a good example here of just like as a team understanding what could go wrong and where the overtrust might happen. And then in this case, actually costing the user money as a result, and then figuring out how to backfill that by bringing in this kind of safety net underneath that behavior to make sure that that it's working appropriately. And you'll find even more in the pattern itself. There's a little bit more detail in the guidebook, but a lot of the methodology is really just being honest and upfront with the user where the system doesn't work well. And that takes being honest and upfront as a team and being willing to take that step to do something that we don't usually do in the technology industry, which says, please don't use it in this situation. And I don't mean this in like uh, like a legalese kind of way. I mean to like actually like use that in the like the just the routine way in which the product communicates with the user to just be like on the up and up about the best ways to use it. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, yes, thank you. Another question here from Fred. How can people innovate in this space if magic seems to be too foreign
Mm.
for a lot of users?
Yeah, interesting question. You'll notice in all of that stuff that I talked about that like I didn't at any point say like don't build the new thing. We still, in the Google Clips example, we still built the camera and delivered it in such a way that provided like what we felt at the time was like a unique benefit to users that they didn't have coming from any other product. And so the important part is to just like focus more on the benefit, not the fact that it's magic new technology, and to focus on like I said, scaffolding it around familiar mental models in order to help them bootstrap. And we think of this as like we often call this the steering wheel on the self-driving car. That as self-driving cars become more prevalent, we're going to see them shift into the mainstream at some point in the future. And they're built on this notion that it is a car the same way that I'm used to a car, that even has a steering wheel that right now, if you see like testing videos of the way they work, that the wheel actually like rotates and drives as the car drives itself. This is based on the notion that there's I know how a car works, and I know that it has a steering wheel, and so I'm like able to see that happen. But I would imagine over time, years and years from now, as people get more used to it, those steering wheels will go away, because the user won't need that type of control and they won't need that mental model in order to grasp it. An early classic like 90s era HCI version of this was like scroll bars and what we call knurling on the edge of a window to give you an affordance to grab and drag that window. That was providing a mental model of like something physical that you could grab a hold of and stretch the window out. And as users became more accustomed to like windowing systems and window-based OSs, a lot of those affordances made their way out, because people didn't need those extra, like I described as footholds anymore. We're in a similar place here where a lot of this technology is fundamentally new. It's not to say don't innovate or don't consider new mental models, but make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and focus only on what's new, because we need, as professionals, we need to be able to bring people along that journey. And if you leave them behind for the sake of like, oh, this is new and people just need to get used to it, you're not actually doing right by your user. And so we need to be able to sort of like think of it as a step function of like how we sort of progress slowly to the point where we don't need these types of familiar mental models and affordances anymore as the technology becomes more comfortable and familiar.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. And a question from Monish. What are your thoughts about AGI's future in design and UX research in the next 5 to 10 years?
Wow. Cool question. We could have another many hours long sessions about this. Um, I am not a technical expert in like this emerging new tech, but I'm obviously tracking it, working in this field, and I imagine this question is relative to some of the new things that we've seen come out just in the last year or so. So GPT-3, the large language model from OpenAI, and just at I/O, Google I/O last month. I don't know if anybody saw it. Sundar, our CEO at Google, demoed uh, a Google a Google version of something that's very similar, where he talked to the planet Pluto live on stage. These models are really exciting, and they definitely represent a big step forward. I know that there are some people in the industry that like to think of them as like AGI is here, and uh, other people are a lot more skeptical, because at the end of the day, these are really just like really fancy text predictors, the same way that your keyboard on your phone is a text predictor. And so I think it remains to be seen, but I definitely think there's basically no doubt that we're somewhere on an exponential curve, and the technology is just going to take off more and more here in the next few years. And staying ahead of it, in this with this user-centered mindset, to make sure that we're understanding, again, the mental model that we present to the user about how it works and what it can do and what it can't do. Like, all of these lessons that I just went over are just going to become more and more important as the technology advances exponentially, so that it doesn't get out from under us, in terms of like the way that we present it to the world, and the guardrails that we put on it and the things that we allow it to do. Would love to talk on that for hours, but I guess that's where I'll leave it for now.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting, talking to the planet Pluto. Can you remember what it was saying?
Well, he asked it a bunch of questions about space and the solar system, and this is a language model that is able to like interpret and answer those questions, just like based on a voice or a text chat. It's really kind of impressive stuff.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, we've got a question about the workshop.
Great.
What kind of team structure is the workshop designed for?
Mm.
Who should be invited?
Oh, great. I love that question. So, like I said, we designed it fully in the pandemic to be run virtually. We've tested it a ton of times. But the basic answer to this is anybody who's relevant to the decision making that you want to do in the product. We tend to start with UXers and PMs who are making those kinds of decisions, because different organizations, even different teams within Google, have different kind of engineering cultures, and sometimes the engineers want to be there, and they want to be in the muck making those kinds of decisions, and sometimes they just want you to leave them alone so that they can code. And it really just depends on the product and the team. When we can have engineers in the room, we love to, because one of the real benefits of running a workshop like this, where you've got the team like in the room or in a virtual room together making these decisions, is that like what comes out the other side is not just the product ideas, but like an actual like shared understanding, consensus on what you're trying to do. And then the more people you have to then like take that back to and pitch it to, who weren't in the room, through the process of that decision making, the more it's work that you're going to have to do to then like get it really off the ground. And so we tended to keep these workshops around 10 people, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the team and how comfortable you are with facilitation and breaking people into groups and all that kind of stuff. All of that is in the facilitation guide in terms of like how to structure it. Um, but roughly 10 people is like a rule of thumb starting point, and then it's a matter of like who the like right level of decision makers are. And I could get all into the weeds of like calibrating that here in terms of like, well, if you get too high level in the organization, then you're going to be asking a lot of time from like a senior leader or something like that. So those types of people you might want to bring in like a particular touch points, or have things scheduled where you go over everything with them after the fact, or you invite them in for a particular like critique or voting exercise, like that kind of stuff. But like get your first level decision makers, like your UX lead and your product lead, like for sure should be in the room, so that you're not coming out and then having to pitch everything you came up with like all the way back up the chain. And again, like this depends on the size of your organization and everything. It's like I would imagine there are people here watching this that are like in organizations where the entire company is smaller than 10 people. So it really depends, but generally the idea is like UX and PM first, engineers if they can, and then decision makers in the room as much as possible.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Well, I think that is all for the questions. So everyone is really appreciating the answers and all the detail you went into. So yeah, that is all for today. Time's up. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for watching at home. We really appreciate you joining us today and for yeah, sharing your questions. And a massive thank you to Gabe Clapper for honouring us with your presence and sharing your very interesting review of the guidebook.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, so there's a link to the guidebook in the description on YouTube. And yeah, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Awards Academy.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.